2 years ago, a New York Times bombshell exposed film producer Harvey Weinstein's history of sexual harassment and assault. It snowballed and has led to a cultural reckoning. Here for their perspectives on the Me Too movement 2 years on, Deepa Mattu, lawyer and executive director of the Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic, Janice Rubin, co-founder and co-managing partner at the employment law firm Rubin Tomlinson, Tanya Van Biesen, executive director of the global nonprofit Catalyst in Canada, Laurie Haskell, clinical psychologist and associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. And we welcome back Robin Doolittle, investigative reporter with the Global Mail and the author of Had It Coming? What's Fair in the Age of #MeToo. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Very nice to have you all. As I said at the very top, it's 2 years in, and the #MeToo movement, has it brought systemic change to the lives of women? I'll start with you, Laurie.
So it's a
big question.
That's a really big question to start with. I don't think so. I think it's been a really important conversation. I think it really brought to attention to people that these are not private acts. The magnitude of the problem was recognized. I think the institutional betrayals was recognized. And I think it meant people had different questions about how could this happen? How could this be so pervasive? And I think it also had different questions around what should we do about it? But I think for women many women already knew this was as pervasive as it is, I think it gave women permission to recognize experiences of sexual harassment. But I still, I'm also a psychologist with a private practice. I still see women are afraid to go forward. The psychological burden of what you need to face if you want a remedy, if you want someone to recognize your experience. For a lot of women, it's too big of a price to pay to go forward into the system.
Tanya, 2 years on, has this brought about change?
I would agree with Laurie. I think it has brought about some systemic change in terms of organizations, how they think about this. They've updated their policies. There's more openness to have the conversation. But for the women that are most affected by these issues, and we talk a lot about what's happening in Hollywood, but let's face it, it's women in precarious work. It's women on front lines that are working in hotels and fast food organizations and all these places where they don't have the platform to talk about this. Has a lot changed? I don't think a lot has changed. As a society, we've become desensitized to these issues almost.
Even though we seem to be talking more about it?
We're talking more about it, but we also seem to think a lot of this stuff is somehow acceptable or it's not a big deal or, in all this conversation, somehow men have become the victims. I'd like to talk about that today. How did that happen?
Okay, we'll unpack that in a few minutes. Janice?
I agree and disagree. I agree that we still have extraordinary problems to deal with in terms of harassment, sexism, discrimination in workplaces. That's sort of the area in which I play. But I actually see that the needle has moved a bit. And perhaps I'm a little bit more optimistic than Laurie and Tanya. And I know through the vantage point of what we do, that has really changed in the last couple of years in terms of who is calling us, what they're asking for. Prior to 2 years ago, we would never hear from a board. We are regularly now, members of our firm, presenting in front of boards about what is sexual harassment, creating internal systems to deal with it, leading on these particular issues, how they can hold the workplaces that they monitor accountable. So I do think that the dial or the needle on the dial has moved a bit.
And Deepa?
I kind of want to echo everyone's thought process here. I completely agree with Laurie. If you just look at the system and we purely look at the system as a legal system or a social construct system, I don't think we have moved a lot. I agree with you that it seems that there is a little bit of this, one more time you're talking about Me Too, right? So there is this sense of almost like a fatigue that people are expressing about Me Too. But at the same time, the reality is that all of us on this table are busier. We have more work coming our way than we can handle. At my clinic alone, our numbers have more than doubled at this point. We are heading into a space where we are finding it overwhelming to handle the number of calls that come to our clinic asking for help. So has something shifted? Definitely something has shifted. But has system adjusted itself? I think we have done a little bit more of a lip service than actually adjusting the system.
So you're saying that it's given people permission to talk about it?
Absolutely.
Right. And Robin?
Yeah, Me Too worked. Sexual assault, sexual harassment is done. So
We can go home. There's no need for this
yeah.
conversation.
No, I mean, I think what's changed is it's no longer politically correct to turn the other way, at least at these big corporate entities. We know sexual assault complaints are up. We know reports of sexual harassment is up. Have we seen a reduction in the amount that it's happening? No. Have we seen an increase in conviction rates? No. We know these issues are still a problem. Now what?
Mm-hmm. I wanted to read something from the book, she said, the two New York Times reporters who broke the Harvey Weinstein story 2 years ago. In the months after we broke the Weinstein story, as the hashtag #MeToo movement exploded, so did new debates about topics ranging from date rape to child sexual abuse to gender discrimination and even to awkward encounters at parties. This made the public conversation feel rich and searching, but also confusing. Were the goals to eliminate sexual harassment, reform the criminal justice system, smash the patriarchy, or flirt without giving offense? Had the reckoning gone too far, with innocent men tarnished with less than convincing proof, or not far enough with a frustrating lack of systemic change? Many saw the movement as a type of reckoning. Is that problematic, Lori?
Is it problematic in terms of
It being seen as a reckoning?
Yes, I think this was a really slow build to get to this point, and I think that, you know, in 2006, Tarana Burke talked about Me Too, and this was lost, and she wanted
to political activist. Yeah.
Yes, and she said Me Too to Black girls who were reporting all kinds of sexual assault and rape, and she wanted to have a sense of community, a sense of empathy, to have people have greater understanding. So I think now this second round is a buildup of all that recognition and change. And I think that there is more of a focus on, again, like I said, how systemic and how big this is. And I think the change is going to be slow. I think we've had this watershed moment of recognizing the pervasiveness, but I think the change is going to be slow. I think people were really motivated in the beginning, thinking, what can we do? How can we change this? But the complexity of this problem and how pervasive and what kinds of things need to change, I think then people were faced with that and we're thinking, this is not good enough. And we are looking at policies and procedures. I've been working with police across the country for years now, and they're very open to this. But we want a change to be on two levels. We want more external recognition and consequences to deter people, but we wanted internal change. We wanted people to be more in tune, more empathic. We wanted people to say, I don't want to harm someone, I don't want to cross that line. And instead we're getting people who want to be protective, who want to say, we've got to protect ourselves from false allegations, rather than what can we do to make sure we never commit these kinds of offenses. So that switch is a real problem.
Well, one of the criticisms over the Me Too movement is that there has been a mob mentality and that men were losing their jobs without due process. Janice, do you worry about that?
What I am interested in as a lawyer is that we address these systemic issues. We address, the systemic issues arise from a culture. But when someone is accused of wrongdoing, that they be afforded a fair process to respond, and a fair process. That incorporates some of what Lori has to say. Fair process. For complainants in terms of a safe space for them to come forward and tell their story, but also for those who are accused of that wrongdoing. And I think that ultimately that's going to serve Me Too far better than rushing to judgment. There have been examples in the last couple of years when things become public, where the person is in fact tried in the media, and not really given a fair opportunity to respond.
Deepa, what about the falsely accused?
To be honest with you, I would like to use a proverb which is originally in my language, so I'd like to try to translate it. They say that the mistakes that are done are in moments, sometimes pay in centuries. So I think the wrongs that were done against women, we have paid for centuries. So now when the Me Too movement is happening and things are coming forward, paying attention to those few cases which are probably not accurate, or there is some false accusations happening, I think we are really doing disservice to women, because silencing of violence is not new. And silencing of women's rights is also not new. When women wanted to right to vote, they were told they were asking for a wrong thing, because they should not be voting. So thinking about different movements and different times when women have asserted for their rights and what has happened to that, we need to remember that these conversations, when we put too much attention to the false accusations or those cases where there should have been a little bit more fair process, and all of those conversations are important. I'm not saying it. As a lawyer, I definitely believe in due process. But at the same time, we need to remember the wrongs were done for way too long. So in this moment, when there is a change or turning of tables happening, people need to be a little bit more compassionate towards the whole process.
Well, because I think in the past, too, we didn't have social media. And now we do have that element where someone can say something, and if it's false, someone's reputation is ruined. And even just to sit here and looking at this table, it's all women talking about that. Yep. Robin, where are the men? Because we need to engage men in this conversation, yes?
Yeah, I mean, that is the key, I think, to progress, is bringing men in. I think men are a little unsure of where they fit into this right now, what they can say. I think on the false accusation question, it's frustrating to just hear it constantly brought up over and over again, because we know the statistics are so low. Like, the odds of being falsely accused of sexual assault
What are the statistics?
Most academic, respected studies pin it between 2 and 8%. So you're more likely to make up that your car was stolen and file a false insurance claim than a false report of sexual assault. That said, there is a very real fear among men about false accusations. And it is true that even an accusation can hang over you. And I think we need to hear that. We can't just dismiss that claim exists. I mean, to address the elephant in the room, I spend an entire chapter in the book looking at the accusation made against Steve Paikin. That case, I think, is held up as an example of, look, the system works. So a woman, Sarah Thompson, a respected, controversial and respected Toronto politician, accused Steve Paikin of extorting sex from her, or trying to. And she made an accusation, and TVO, I think, was widely praised for not jumping to any conclusions. They hired an outside third-party investigator. There was, in some ways, lucky for Steve Paikin, lots of evidence that they could look at and chase down. And in the end, that allegation was not substantiated. He is not thought of, I think, as a Me Too offender, and everyone sort of moved on. This is a case that works. Look, there was due process, a complainant raised a concern, but I wanted to hear from Steve, do you feel like you were exonerated, that this is over? And he says, he recognizes that, sure, most people probably don't think that this happened. I don't think that it happened, by the way, and I looked at the evidence as well. But it's a cloud that follows him around, and he still feels it, more than a year later. And I think we need to hear that concern from men and validate it. Like, it's real, so let's talk about it.
And Tanya?
It's such an interesting discussion. The work that we do with organizations every day, we say to them, one of the most important things you can do outside of education and making sure your processes and your policies are in place is make sure that you provide support to both the complainant and the accused. That is critical, because there has to be due process, and I agree with Janice, the very worst outcome for men and women is when we have men who are falsely accused. So that is a bad outcome for everybody. But 2 to 8% of cases are false accusations. So we have to put that in context. And what I worry about is that the story has become about all these false accusations, as opposed to all the real situations that have been going on for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and continue to go on today. So we have to put all of that in a context. And unfortunately, I think the balance has been lost a little bit. I agree with Robin. This notion of fear around men engaging in discussions of equity, just broadly equity or sexual harassment, is huge. We've been researching that for 15 years. And to put our heads in the sand as women and say, well, that fear should be dismissed, or it's silly, or it's this, or it's that, it's real, and we need to talk about it. And I think the most powerful thing we can do right now is to bring men into this conversation and to this notion of the Mike Pence rule, I won't go anywhere with a woman unless my wife is present, or I won't. It's so ridiculous. This is the time where we need men to step in, right? To step in and support women, and as women, we need to be accepting of the fact that, hey, maybe they'll say something that we find wrong or offside, and not vote them off the island. Like, we need them in the game.
Janice, I know you want to say something.
Yeah, so I want to say that in the last couple of years, now this is anecdotal, this comes from our practice, but we've seen many examples of people sort of rising up and showing extraordinary leadership on this issue, both men and women. Yeah. So I'll give you an example of a man that actually comes from your investigation, Robin. I had a client call me, who's a CEO, who said, I've just been reading Robin's articles, and that prompted me to look at our own internal system of investigating, now in my world, sexual harassment, not sexual assault. And I found out that of the 15 investigations that we did in the last couple of years, only 2 substantiated the allegations of the complainant. Now, that is wrong, and I'm going to look deeper to see what the problem is. And of course, the internal problems were very much like the internal problems that you were reporting, which the investigators didn't understand what sexual harassment was, were kind of shrugging their shoulders, where somebody couldn't offer a full and complete narrative. So that is somebody stepping up to the challenge, and that somebody in that case was a man. The other example that I will give you are bystanders. And in our practice, we've seen sort of an energization, in part because of the zeitgeist, I think, of Me Too, where people are seeing things in the workplace saying, no, that doesn't sound right to me. That sounds like, a Harvey Weinstein thing, or that sounds like a Matt Lauer thing, or that sounds like whatever. I'm going forward. It's not affecting me directly. I'm not the target, but my colleagues are, and I'm in a position to assert something on their behalf. So for me, that's one of the reasons why I'm cautiously optimistic in terms of the needle moving a bit.
Robin, you write a lot about public perception and how the needle has shifted with social media and having this hashtag #MeToo movement. With the U.S. politics kind of dominating, taking up all the oxygen in the room, we saw what happened in the U.S. with Brett Kavanaugh. Do you worry that this now has become a partisan issue? And if it has become a partisan issue, then how do you get people to see beyond that? Robin?
Yeah, that's one of the main things that I write about in the book is that at the end, like, where do we go forward? We need to depoliticize Me Too. Right now, it really has become that issue of, if you're a progressive, you're on the side of survivors, and if you're a right winger, then this is a war on men. There's really no room for the middle, and that's ridiculous. You should be able to say, I absolutely support someone's ability to speak their truth, confront their accuser, be taken seriously, and someone's ability to mount a defense, to defend themselves. To move forward, we need to get away from this. And how do we do that? I think part of it is having conversations, as we keep saying over and over again, but having smart conversations. If you're at Thanksgiving and your Uncle Bob starts complaining about a war on men, maybe don't turn to him and start screaming if you actually want to, try to change his mind. If you don't want to change his mind, then just quietly eat your turkey and, talk about Uncle Bob later. But if you actually want to change his mind, maybe yelling at him about the patriarchy and rape culture and misogyny is not going to do it. You can talk about those issues, just don't use those words, because the Uncle Bobs of the world might be triggered by them.
And Laura, you mentioned Tarana Burke before. She founded the hashtag in 2006, I believe.
That's right.
She's come to question her involvement with the Hollywood actresses, because Elisa Milano actually revitalized the hashtag 2 years ago, 2017.
Yeah.
Why has Tarana had a change of heart?
I think because of the absence of women of color, and in our context of Indigenous women, their stories aren't the stories that are being put forward by the media. They're not part of the Me Too movement. And I actually, I'm working with Indigenous communities around human trafficking and other issues right now. So before I came on the show, I called my contacts and I said, how do you feel Me Too's helped your community? And they got back to me and said, there's a silence. We feel like we're always a footnote. We don't feel like we're part of this. And Tarana Burke, I heard her speak in Boston. She really wanted this to be a movement for all women, to have women's experiences recognized. And yet we're seeing mostly white privileged women who have influence, who have more power, who have more dramatic stories. So I think we need to broaden this. It's a really key time. I mean, the rates of sexual violence in the lives of Indigenous women is over 3 times that of any other women in our communities.
Deepa, why do women from marginalized communities feel like they can't speak up?
There are many reasons. Some are historical, but some are in the context of what happens in their lives on a day-to-day basis. So our clinic works with a lot of non-status, precariously employed women. We actually have a project funded by a man called And Me Too. And it works with women who are precariously employed or are precariously in their immigration status. And on that journey where the system in itself can be their perpetrator at times, and if they engage with the system, they will be, while trying to get justice from a criminal legal system, they would also be getting prosecuted in the immigration system and getting criminalized in the system at times themselves because they are not cooperating with the system the way system wants to may have them speak. In those kind of situations, what choices women do really have, right? And in terms of the historical context of women, Indigenous women, we know that when they talk about the issues of violence in their lives, it is so systemic. It's not necessarily one thing. It's not one incident. It's not one workplace. It's their lives that we are talking about. So the complexity of the women who did not speak in the movement is definitely, I think it has to be a choice-based for any woman. It has to be a self-determination whether you want to speak or not. But we have to remember, some women don't have that choice to make. And I think a lot of marginalized communities come from that perspective.
How do we support them then?
We need to make sure that the resources which we allocate coming out of the Me Too movement are allocated to those women, and that we make sure that they have, in whatever way they organize, if this organizing is going to happen on a kitchen table for them, that organizing is possible for them, or if it is going to happen in a basement of a church, it is possible for them. So making sure that all of those spaces are supported, because we have to remember, Me Too is a social media-based movement, but Me Too movement is not new for women. Women have always alarmed each other of creepers in their lives, right? That Uncle Bob.
You write about that in the book.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah. So women have always done that. I didn't grow up in Canada. I grew up in India. My own personal experience of Me Too are no different than yours or anyone else in the room, right? So we are all very much connected with what our experiences have been.
I would add to that, in a workplace setting, I think one of the big benefits to this discussion around Me Too is what we're talking about right now, is the fact that there have been lost women in this whole discussion. So the fact that we're having this conversation, I think, is critically important. When we work with organizations, we remind them that the complexity of intersectionality is a big, big part of this issue. And so to homogenize all women, I mean, you can't do that in the same way that you can't do that with all men. And so the intersectionalities of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender fluidity, all of those pieces are critically important. So actually, when you're looking at how you establish your policies and your culture of inclusion, you have to actually look at some of these much higher risk groups. So a white woman actually is at a lower risk than a black woman or a woman who identifies as lesbian, or, you know, like all of these things create great complexities. And organizations are open to these discussions to understand, like, all people are not created equally when it comes to the risk of sexual harassment.
Janet?
And I think one of the things that we've come to learn in a more deep way over the last couple of years is underreporting. So, you know, we have a workplace phenomena, a cultural phenomena, and yet very few of these cases ever come forward, whether it's in the criminal context or the workplace context. And when you consider intersectionality there, for somebody to report, if you are gender nonconforming, if you are racialized, the stakes are much higher, as much as the stakes are higher for anybody coming forward. So in terms of the operation of a system, that system has to recognize that for some players, it's just going to be harder. And perhaps there are other ways for people to bring forward their experiences short of making a complaint. Right. So some of the processes that we've been involved in the last couple of years have been proactive assessments. So rather than waiting for a complaint that may never come, because as I say, most people don't complain, we've gone in and we've asked people on an anonymous basis, on a confidential basis, what are your experiences? And when you are able to give them the safety of, your name is not attached to it, we will report back to the employer on a thematic basis, but your voice will be heard in that way. It is extraordinary what people are prepared to tell you.
I think it's really interesting that you said that most people don't report, because
Most people do not.
I think there's a feeling that a lot of people are reporting,
No.
that a lot of people are talking, or a lot of people are complaining.
Stakes are so high. They're
Most people,
so high.
most people don't report, and in fact, according to Angus Reid, there was the survey a couple of years ago. Not only do most people not report, but 89% of women adopt strategies to avoid sexual harassment in the workplace. So it's there, and we kind of think through. Okay, am I going to avoid your poor Uncle Bob, who's the example here? Am I going to take the stairs? Am I going to, move my desk? Am I not going to look up when creepo employee comes down the hall? Right. That is a part of many of our lives.
And Robin, in your book, you address this issue in the workplace, and you said that there's been an emphasis on preventing liability and less concern about the behavior. Why do businesses get co-opted into protecting predators?
I mean, this goes into how far are we moving with Me Too? And what statistics show is that something like 95% of CEOs say sexual harassment is not a problem in their workplace. Like, that's crazy that is a number. It doesn't instill a lot of confidence. I mean, the practical thing, I guess, is employers have to think about liability, right? And it's the same when we talk about the redemption question of whether people who have committed harm deserve a second chance. One of the big things that we want from them is an apology, an honest admission of wrongdoing. The practical side is that, especially if behavior crosses into criminal territory, someone might be reluctant to do that because they could open themselves up to a prosecution. That's why it's just so tricky to look at this from we want movement to come from the top that's going to fix this. It's really about we need to rewire all of our brains, like every person, no matter where you work, no matter what status you're at, about these outdated ideas we have, these rape myths and stereotypes.
Don't you think that's a big ask?
It's a huge ask. But it's possible, because I think if you
It is
polled
possible.
people in the country, is rape good? People would say no. Is sexual harassment good? People would say no. The discrepancy comes on what constitutes that behavior. Most people, I think, are good people. It's just an honest, differing ideas, or we've been wired wrong. So this gets back to the conversation, I think, about consent, which is just so key, and understanding what consent means in a sexual situation, what consent means in a workplace situation. There's one poll that I looked at that said something like a quarter of millennial men think it's okay for a boss to kiss an employee on the cheek, to look at porn at work, to give uninvited shoulder rubs. Like, this is not encouraging. So we can't wait for the boss to fix those guys. We need to get to those guys.
Well, we have a poll of what the situation looks like at work. The organization Lean In did a survey and found that in the wake of the Me Too movement, instead of supporting women at work, men are pulling back. Let's take a look at the numbers. 60% of male managers are uncomfortable mentoring, working alone with, or socializing with women, up from 46% a year ago. 36% of men say they avoid mentoring or socializing with a woman because they're nervous about how it would look. 24% of women say harassment at work is increasing, but 27% of men say that harassment is decreasing. 50% of men say that harassment consequences are more damaging to the careers of harassers, not the victim. Women see this differently. 64% say it's the victims who end up paying a heavier price. Janice, are these? I know I heard a lot of over there.
Yeah.
These are American stats, but
Yeah.
do they paint a similar picture here in Canadian workplaces?
Oh gosh, I don't even know how to answer that question exactly. I mean, I think we're at a particular moment of time. Some of that data resonates with me, and some of it does not. In terms of the perception that victims pay the price, for sure. Historically, when somebody has come forward, if it is investigated and if harassment has been found as a workplace, the historic equation is, okay, what's it worth? Will allow you to kind of make a graceful exit, and if it's worth $50,000, $60,000, out you go, sign a confidentiality agreement, and you're done. So who's the loser there? The complainant, because the complainant has had to exit the workplace. The workplace has not been remedied for her, and typically the person who's engaged in harassment really has not been held accountable in a meaningful way. Maybe a slap on the hand, maybe some coaching, maybe something even less than that. I think that equation is slowly shifting, in part because the legal system is, we haven't really talked that much about it, but at least in the civil area, which I know the best, the legal system is changing, both in terms of the statutory framework that is applied to these kinds of cases as well as case law. In terms of men being afraid to be in a room with a woman alone, I must say from our practice, and I'm not saying that our practice has the truth of all things, that is just not ringing true. I think what may be happening is that there are men now who are being held accountable for behavior that previously has been okay. The gratuitous kiss, the invasion of personal space, the types of behavior that perhaps has been viewed historically as less egregious, and they're unhappy about that. And perhaps that's the iteration of it. But as I say, that is not coming from the work that we do, but that may be, people at the table may be having different experiences.
And Tanya, are women suffering as a consequence of Me Too in the workplace?
When I read those stats, what strikes me is I think there's a lack of education. I still think there's a lack of understanding within workplaces of what constitutes sexual harassment. Like, we think of the egregious issues, the examples that we see in the media, but there's a whole continuum of what constitutes sexual harassment. So I think education for all people in workplaces is really critical to understand what it is, where it starts, because there's an entry point and then everyone should know what that looks like. So I look at that data and I think there's still a lack of understanding among men and women of what constitutes sexual harassment. I do agree with Janice. I think that women ultimately are the losers because not only, even if they're paid out to leave their workplace, those women are struggling to find another job, right? These stories follow them around in the same way that we have these situations where stories follow men around. These stories follow women around too, so it becomes very, very difficult. But again, I look at that data and when Robin was talking about the political divide, I do agree that the vast majority of men are in the middle, and they are good people who don't want to harm other people. Like, I don't believe we live in this big bad world out there. There are some bad apples, but in the middle, there's this group of men who are trying to figure out, what do I do? How can I contribute? How can I be on the right side of this? So I think bystander training is so critical because a lot of this stuff happens when someone is standing by or a group of people are standing by and they know it's wrong or they know it feels offside, but they're just not sure how to engage in that conversation. So I think that's one of the biggest things organizations can do is to engage the employee population and say, hey, we all have accountability. This is not going to come from the CEO exclusively or HR exclusively. We all have a role to play in creating a respectful workplace.
As individuals.
As individuals.
Deepa, what do you think will be the lasting legacy of the Me Too movement?
I think the conversations that we are having, I think this panel and the beginning of the fact that we are thinking about talking to Bob, Uncle Bob, at the dinner table, right? And that those conversations are happening, and we are all engaging in those conversations. I think that's one of definitely the lasting legacy that Me Too movement has left, that it has come out and open, we are talking about it. I also wanted to talk about that the clinic has an independent legal advice project for sexual assault survivors, which includes sexual harassment clients as well. And a lot of women, once they know what their options are, what their choices are, feel a lot more in control just by knowing that, okay, I can do this. Maybe I don't want to do it right away. Maybe I want to think about it, but at least knowing what they can do in these situations is really important, and that's happening because we know that the number of calls we are receiving is going up. So a lot more women are more informed, and I think that's a huge legacy as well. But I just want to say one very quick thing around the fact that men and how they can be part of the movement. I think what is also important for men to remember is that when you want to be an ally, women have to identify you. You cannot just go on the rooftop and yell and say, I'm an ally, because that's not how allyship works. And in terms of they're not mentoring us, I'm not sure how many of them were mentoring us already to begin with. So they don't want to mentor us now because women are coming and talking about it. I don't know.
We've run out of time. I wish we had more time to talk about this, but we thank you all for making the time to come to TVO to talk about this important anniversary. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.